A boy named T.S. lives on a local ranch in Montana with his cowboy father, scientist mother, and two siblings, Gracie and Layton. While Layton is more interested in doing cowboy things like their dad, T.S. doesn't believe he's cut out for such work. Due to this, Layton gets to spend more time with their dad, with the boy even having access to a gun at his young age. One day, while T.S. visits a museum, he walks into a classroom where a professor is talking about perpetual motion.
Thank you.
During the class, one of the students mentions that he doesn't think perpetual motion is relevant in the current world, but the professor says it is. He also adds that all scientists should take on a challenge to build a perpetual motion machine. This lecture interests T.S., and after the professor ends the class, he claps in excitement.
Thank you very much.
He then goes to see the professor to tell him that he's ready to take on the challenge. The professor doesn't seem quite confident in the boy's ability to do anything, but he still pats his head before leaving. The next day, T.S. pretends to be sick so that he won't have to follow Gracie and the rest of his family to a show they're headed to. Since he's now home alone, T.S. then starts working on his scientific challenge. Days later, while Layton is playing with a gun inside the barn while T.S. measures the gunshot, he mistakenly shoots himself and dies. A year later, while T.S. and Gracie are sitting on the porch, they hear the house landline ringing. Shortly after, their mom, Claire, comes outside to complete her research work on insects. As T.S. and Gracie ask who called, Claire initially ignores them because she's too focused on her work. However, as Gracie asks again, Claire mentions that the call was actually for T.S. Gracie is shocked by this because she knows her brother doesn't have any friends, but Claire adds that T.S. can still go and check who it is because she left the person on hold. Following this, T.S. enters the house and finds the phone.
Hello?
He then speaks to a lady named Miss Gibson, who says she's calling from the Smithsonian Institute. T.S. is shocked by this, and even though the woman mentions his name as the person she intended to call, he says it's his dad's name. He then pretends to walk a few steps away to make it seem like he went to get his father to answer the phone. After he speaks to Gibson again, she tells him to pass the phone to his dad.
Could you hand him the phone, please?
But T.S. says he's a mute and he'll be speaking for him instead. Following this, the woman mentions that the Smithsonian received T.S.'s work on perpetual motion. She also adds that because of how great his work was, the Institute has decided to give him the prestigious Baird Award. T.S. is shocked to hear this, especially since he only sent blueprints of his potential invention, but he tries to remain calm. He then asks if Gibson is the boss at the Smithsonian, and she says that even though she's a secretary there, people often call her the boss. After thinking about the possibility of going to Washington to receive the prize and give a speech, T.S. says his dad won't be able to come because he has a lot of work to do.
I have too much work to finish.
Despite this, Gibson says she's ready to do whatever it takes to make him come to Washington, but T.S. still mentions that there's just a lot of work he can't leave behind. He ends the call after this and looks disappointed as he heads out.
What are you doing?
Because he knows that he has missed a very good opportunity because he doesn't want to leave home. When he gets outside, Gracie asks who he spoke to, and T.S. lies that it was a journalist who wanted to ask him questions about his research. Gracie sounds pissed to hear this because she can't believe her little brother is getting an opportunity to be on TV, even though she's the one who wants to be a reality TV star. The next day, T.S. goes to see his mom while she's working, and he asks what she'll do if her research doesn't save the creatures she has been working on. Claire asks what he means, and T.S. says he's just worried that his mom had to abandon everything else just to focus on her work. Claire looks concerned and wonders if he's trying to say that she hasn't been there for her family since the previous year. She then asks T.S. if there's anything she stopped doing that he'd like her to start doing again. However, T.S. says he doesn't know, and he eventually continues talking about her research. The next day at school, T.S. gets a poor grade in a test, so he confronts his teacher about this.
Really, sir?
However, the man seems quite angry because T.S. is always trying to behave like he's smarter than him. Despite this, T.S. still makes a case for better grades, but the teacher dismisses him and even jokes about his socks to make his classmates laugh at him. Later that day, after T.S. arrives from school, his dad asks if he'd like to come with him to the farm. T.S. looks surprised by this, but he immediately accepts to follow his dad. On the way to the farm, T.S. then thinks about how his dad has felt lonely around the house since his brother died. Since he now gets a chance to spend some time with his dad, T.S. hopes that he'll get to impress him. After a while, T.S. and his dad see a goat stuck on the fence. Since it's a minor thing that his dad expects him to be able to handle, T.S. is told to help free the goat. He then heads out of the car, but while he's helping the goat, a snake appears near him. T.S. is too scared to do anything, but instead of running away, he just closes his eyes. Luckily, his dad quickly leaves the car and shoots the snake. Even though T.S. believes he disappointed his dad, the man still pats his back and says there wasn't much he could have done. On their ride back home, T.S. realizes that he will never survive as a cowboy on the ranch like Leighton and his dad. Since he has a chance to change his fortune and leave the house, he decides to head to Washington the next day. While the family is having dinner that night, Claire mentions that she'll be leaving Montana for a while to collect specimens in the city. Her husband doesn't have a problem with this, and as he leaves the table, Claire asks if T.S. would like to come with her. Since he already has other plans, T.S. says he won't be able to follow her. Shortly after, he then uses the house landline to send a voicemail to Miss Gibson to inform her that he has changed his mind and will be coming to Washington for the award ceremony. Gracie hears T.S. talking about this, but she doesn't seem bothered because she thinks he's just messing around. Following this, T.S. packs his bags and writes a note to his family, informing them that he's leaving for work and will be back soon. He also picks his mom's diary and goes to check Leighton's room for one more time before he leaves. A while later, T.S. leaves the house with his luggage, and as he walks down the road, his dad drives past him. T.S. is shocked to see that he didn't stop to ask where he's going, but since this means he's likely not bothered, the boy starts walking faster so he can catch a train that goes from Montana to Chicago. A few hours later, T.S. arrives at the train station and paints the streetlight red so that the train will stop. As the train stops, T.S. is about to climb on board when some train guards stop him. Even though they try to chase him down, T.S. loses the train guards and enters one of the rail cars. The train then starts moving again, and T.S. looks happy to finally be on his way to Washington. He also seems to enjoy the ride. And while on board, he pretends to see Leighton with him so they can spend some time together. Shortly after, the train makes a stop in Wyoming, and since the train guards there are about to conduct an inspection, T.S. quickly hides inside the camper van being transported on the train. Just as the guard is about to check the van, T.S. pretends to be one of the cardboard frames inside the van, so the man eventually walks away. Following this, T.S. is free again, and he gets to sleep on a proper bed. A while later, the train stops again at a station in Nebraska, and since he's hungry, T.S. sneaks out of the camper van and sees a hot dog stand. As he wonders how he'll get there, a man named Two Clouds sees him and calls him to stop hiding under the train. T.S. does as the man says, and when they meet, he introduces himself. He also says that the S in his name is for Sparrow. Two Clouds then asks why his parents named him after a bird, and he says that a sparrow crashed against the window in his house just as he was about to be born.
That's what my mom told me.
Instead of staying outside on the rail, Two Clouds takes T.S. into the bunker he's living in. While they're inside there, Two Clouds then asks if T.S. really believes the story about the sparrow because it means he was born in the house, but the boy says it's what he was told. Following this, Two Clouds tells him a story his grandmother used to tell him about a sparrow who got stranded and was helped by a pine tree. Since the facts in the story seem odd, T.S. says he thinks the man's grandmother lied to him.
Your grandmother lied to you.
Two Clouds doesn't seem bothered by this, but as he asks what T.S. wants to do next, he says he wants to get some hot dogs. Shortly after, the man bids him goodbye, and T.S. goes to the nearby hot dog shop. Just as he's receiving his order, two cops arrive at the stand to request permission from the chef to put a poster of a missing boy outside her shop. The woman agrees to this, but T.S. looks nervous because he's the boy on the poster. Before he leaves, the woman suspects that something is odd about him, and as she asks why he left his parents at home, T.S. says he's an orphan.
I don't have a mother, ma'am. My parents are dead.
He also adds that he's not the missing boy. After the woman lets him leave, T.S. sees a nearby payphone and thinks about calling his family. However, since he knows that they'd likely tell him to come back, T.S. just walks past it and returns to the camper van to eat his food. After a while, he decides to check his mom's diary. As he then reads it, he sees a page where she mentions that she thinks her husband no longer loves her. T.S. is shocked and confused by this, but he assumes that his mom didn't mean what she wrote. While reading the book, he also comes across a page where Claire mentions that she still finds herself going to Leighton's room to wake him up for school. As she adds that she feels empty, T.S. feels sad and cries. The next day, he finally arrives in Chicago and leaves the train with his luggage. Before he moves on, he takes a few things from the luggage and keeps them inside a small backpack. He then hides his luggage inside an electrical grid box, after which he walks away. On his way to get a bus to Washington, a cop approaches him and asks what's inside his backpack. Since someone recently spray painted some of the silos in the area, the cop suspects that T.S. did it. The boy denies it, but this doesn't stop the cop from chasing him because he believes T.S. is messing with him. After a while, T.S. reaches a canal gate that is opening. Even though the cop believes he won't jump, T.S. takes the risk and ends up hanging on the other side of the gate. The cop looks scared because the boy could fall, but luckily, T.S. makes it across. He also seems to have injured himself in the process, but he then heads to the road to find a Good Samaritan who can take him to Washington. A few minutes later, a man named Ricky stops his truck to help T.S. after he says he's going to the Smithsonian.
To the Smithsonian?
During the journey, Ricky sees T.S.'s injury and says he needs to see a medic, but the boy says he's fine. Shortly after, Ricky takes a picture and says that he always snaps hitchhikers before and after they get to their destination. He then says it's always nice because he gets to meet new, interesting people. T.S. eventually sleeps in the truck, but when he wakes up, Ricky tells him that they've arrived at the Smithsonian. T.S. is happy about this, and Ricky also takes a picture of them at his destination. Following this, he tells T.S. that even though he doesn't know what the boy is looking for, he should never change. T.S. thanks him for the advice and tells him never to change too. After a while, T.S. enters the Smithsonian and tells the ladies at the front desk that he's looking for Miss Gibson because he's going to give a speech at an event in a few days. The ladies are shocked by this, but they tell him to take a seat while they call Gibson. When she finally meets him,
Can I help you, young man?
Gibson says she remembers his voice as the son of the award recipient. However, T.S. explains that he lied about it because he didn't think he'd make it. He also says that his parents are dead. Gibson looks shocked because she doesn't think a young 10-year-old boy can invent anything, but as she starts thinking of what to do next, T.S. explains what he sent to the Smithsonian and how he was able to use the theory of perpetual motion to derive it. Gibson and the front desk ladies are shocked to hear this because it's quite clear that T.S. knows what he's talking about. Following this, Gibson hugs him because she can now be the guardian of a prodigy. Shortly after, she takes T.S. to see a doctor while she tells someone on the phone about how exciting it is to see that the recipient of the prestigious award is a young boy. When he's done with his medical checkup, Gibson tells T.S. that she'd like to write his speech for the event, but he says he'd do it by himself. Even though she prefers to write it for him, Gibson seems impressed by his desire to do things by himself.
Okay.
A while later, T.S. is then taken to a lab where his brain activity is evaluated. While he's inside the lab, Leighton appears to him and asks why he's settling to be a lab rat even though he came so far for recognition. T.S. doesn't seem bothered by this, and after Gibson is told that there's nothing special about the boy's brain, she believes that the readings are wrong, so she instructs a nurse to let the boy go. The next day, T.S. is then taken to the award ceremony. Before everyone comes to their seats, they seem quite impressed to see a young boy as the award winner. When Gibson is asked by a journalist about what she thought of giving the boy the prestigious award, she lies that from their first conversation, she didn't care that he was a young boy. After a while, some of the guests approach T.S. and commend him for his work. A few minutes later, T.S. is invited to the stage to give his speech. Even though he's nervous at first, he eventually starts by thanking everyone present, after which he takes a while to talk about his perpetual motion machine. After this, he stays silent for a while and mentions that he lost his brother a year ago. Everyone looks sad to hear this, but T.S. still continues talking about how he and his brother were close and how the death messed up their family. During his speech, he mentions that he and Leighton used to work together and that while his brother shoots with his gun, he'd always take readings to measure the sound of the gunshot. On the day of the accident, T.S. mentions that something was wrong with the gun, and while he held it for Leighton to fix, the trigger went off by itself and shot his brother, who flew across the room.
I was alone.
Following this, he immediately went to call his father to report that something was wrong with Leighton, who was found dead and later taken away in an ambulance. T.S. then says he's not happy that no one talks about Leighton anymore at home. He adds that he has always believed it was his fault. As he ends his speech, everyone claps for him. And Gibson also feels relieved that no one judged him for what happened. Meanwhile, it turns out that Claire is at the event, and she has heard everything her son said. The next day, Gibson starts taking T.S. for several interviews and media outings to make him popular while standing near him as his guardian. A few days later, she also informs him that the White House is already sniffing around and that if things go well, they could meet the president soon. Even though she looks quite excited, T.S. doesn't seem interested in being popular. Later that day, T.S. calls his family landline from Gibson's office, but no one answers the phone. The following day, T.S. is invited to be a guest on a show hosted by a man named Roy. While preparing him for the questions he'll be asked, Gibson tells T.S. that if he's asked about what happened to Leighton, he should just say that he didn't understand what happened, and that's why he immediately ran for help. Shortly after, Roy gets ready to take T.S. with him for the show. Gibson says she needs to also appear next to him, but Roy tells her that she'll have to watch everything from the green room. She's not too happy about this, but she eventually agrees to stay in the green room. After a while, Roy starts the interview and asks several questions about T.S.'s childhood and how he developed an interest in science. T.S. answers the questions well, but Roy still tries to be intimidating. He then asks about Leighton, but T.S. tells him exactly what Gibson told him to say. He also showcases a prototype of his machine, which Roy doesn't seem really interested in. Meanwhile, Gracie sees her brother on TV and looks really proud as she speaks to her friend on the phone about him. Shortly after, though, Roy says he has another special guest, who turns out to be Claire. T.S. is shocked to see her, and as he refers to her as his mom, Gibson looks pissed because she can longer be his guardian. T.S. then confesses that he lied about being an orphan because he was scared that the Smithsonian would send him back home if they knew he had run away from home. Roy also asks Claire how she felt when T.S. left. Claire says that she was largely unhappy and that she even spent time distracting herself with work. Roy tries to cut her short, but she tells him to keep quiet while she talks. Following this, she tells T.S. that Leighton's death was not his fault. She adds that no parent should have given their son a gun to use while being unsupervised. Just then, Roy tells them to hug, and they do this. As they're leaving, though, Roy tries to stop them, but Claire doesn't wait. Before they leave, Gibson comes out of the green room to insult T.S. for being a liar, but this gets her slapped by Claire. As Roy also stops them, T.S.'s dad appears behind him and punches the host. T.S. looks happy to see his dad, but he first apologizes for lying that his dad was dead. The man doesn't seem bothered by this, and he says he's there to take his wife and son home. On the way, T.S. asks why his dad didn't stop him when he was leaving, but the man says he never saw him. It then turns out that while he was driving away that day, he was looking down because he wanted to pick up something that fell. Following this, T.S. heads home with his parents. Several months later, Claire is now pregnant with another baby, and as she seems to feel something in her stomach, T.S. asks if she's about to give birth in the house again. Claire is shocked to hear this, but she says she has never given birth in the house. T.S. then asks why he was named Sparrow, so Claire says that it was actually Gracie who saw the dead bird that crashed against the window on the day he was born. Since his sister believed that the bird reincarnated as T.S., she suggested naming him Sparrow. They laugh about this, but just then, the toasting machine sparks and gets broken. Following this, T.S. jokes about how the new baby could be named Toaster. After the baby is born, T.S. then completes his perpetual motion machine, which is then used to rock the baby's cradle on the front porch.